You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thank you for joining me today on the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast. So today we're going to discuss the keto diet. The keto diet is short for ketogenic diet. And what that is that's a diet that is extremely restricted in carbohydrates and very high in fat. Typically, on a keto diet, you have less than about 25 to 50 grams of carbohydrates. So 25 grams of carbohydrates would be the equivalent of maybe 2 pieces of bread. That would be your entire carbohydrate intake for the day. And so it's extremely low. It's high in fat. Usually about 75% of your calories throughout the day come from fat. About 20% would come from protein, and an additional 5% would come from the carbohydrates. Now, there are variations, and not unlike the Mediterranean diet, there's no strict definition of a ketogenic diet, but this is essentially the composition. Of course, the lower the carbohydrate intake, the better the ketosis, which is really the purpose of the diet. So how does it work? Well, preferentially, humans are designed to run on carbohydrates, specifically glucose. Although I've said before, there's no absolute requirement for sugar. We do function well on carbohydrates because it's rapidly converted to glucose, which then can serve to fuel our muscles, our musculoskeletal system, and our brain. So when we eat carbohydrates, that functions as our primary source of fuel, and it's the first thing that's used. So as we take in carbohydrates, it's broken down, and that is our primary fuel source. Then excess carbohydrates are stored, and they're either stored in the liver and skeletal muscle as glycogen, or they can be converted into fats and stored in fat cells as triglycerides. The storage function is actually a primitive function that works well. When we were roaming the earth and hunters and gatherers and eating berries, you didn't necessarily always know when your next meal would come from. So when you ate excess calories, the ability for our body to take those and store them served as a fantastic survival mechanism. But in 2025, when for the most part food is readily available and oftentimes excessively available, what happens is we overeat. And then when that gets stored, that's fine if it were just an occasional event. But what happens is we constantly overeat. And so then it gets stored. And you can only store so much excess carbohydrate as glycogen. Right? There are limits to the amount of glycogen that can be stored in the liver and the skeletal muscle system. So then it gets converted to fat and it's stored as fat cells, which can then be broken down over time. But if you're always taking in enough food, there's no impetus to the body to require that to burn fat. So of course, no matter what the macronutrients are, when you go on a calorie restricted diet, you do begin to break down initially some of that glycogen, and then eventually you start to oxidize or burn some of the fat, and that ultimately leads to weight loss. So on a ketogenic diet, you're really just sort of accelerating that entire process. So what happens is you take in very low carbs, so you don't have many calories as a source of energy for your immediate fuel source. And so what happens then is you begin to break down fat. Initially, when you go on a low carbohydrate diet, right, you kind of have to burn through your stored glucose, which is what's called glycogen. Let's just back up just a little bit and let's just talk about when we eat. When we eat foods, really no matter what it is, right, we chew it up and our salivary glands and our teeth, right, they really help to kind of break things up. And then we swallow it, goes into our stomach. Then we have gastric acids. It kind of breaks things down a little bit more, and then it goes out of our stomach into our small bowel, where then we have bile and some various enzymes that come from the pancreas that really help to break things down. And so you break carbohydrates down ultimately into glucose. And proteins, they get broke down into their elemental building block, which is what is called amino acids. And then fats get broke down into fatty acids. And when you have 3 fatty acids combined with a glycerol molecule, that's what you call a triglyceride. So you break these down. Of course, when we eat, we know that the insulin levels help to drive the sugar into the cells. And then once it's into the cells, that glucose is then, through a series of biochemical reactions, converted into pyruvate, which then goes into acetyl-CoA, which then goes into the Krebs cycle. And remember, that's in the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, creates ATP and it creates energy. Now, you can also get to pyruvate from proteins and from fat. It's just a little more complicated, But it's easier to go from carbohydrates to glucose into the Krebs cycle. So that's why it's used as our primary fuel source. And then when you have excess, it gets stored, right? Now, there's no storage of excess proteins. So the proteins get broke down and the amino acids are used to replace other proteins, sort of older, degrading proteins. But there's no storage of excess protein per se. Now, of course, if you eat a lot of protein and you are weightlifting and doing things like that, you can't hypertrophy. You can store it in that function. It's not exactly storage, it's synthesis, but that is a different process. But glucose gets stored as glycogen, which then can later be broke down back into glucose. And when we store glycogen, insulin helps to drive the glucose into the cell, and the excess glucose then ultimately can be converted into glycogen. And remember, the opposite of insulin is glucagon. So in times where we have low blood sugar or we're needing energy, the elevated glucagon levels then break that glycogen that's stored in our liver and skeletal muscle back into glucose. The same is true with fat storage, right? Excess fat storage that doesn't get used gets ultimately stored as fat, and excess glucose, once you've filled your glycogen stores to the max, right, then that excess glucose gets converted into fat and then gets stored as fat. Over time, when you have excess fat and you're always able to eat an appropriate amount of calories to match what you need, then you would maintain your weight. But if you take in excess calories consistently, not only have you then topped off your glycogen stores, but you begin to store as fat, you never get into that component where you're breaking down the fat because you're always taking in enough calories. So when you go on a calorie restricted diet, which ultimately is what leads to weight loss, you kind of deplete some of those glycogen stores, but you also start to burn some of that fat. And that's how you begin to lose weight. So the keto diet just really accelerates that. So what it does is it cuts off carbohydrate intake, then significantly reduces your initial fuel source, or the immediate fuel source, which is glucose. And then if you've really restricted it down to 25 to 50 grams, then you begin to break down all the glycogen that's stored in your liver and in your skeletal muscle. Now, interestingly, under normal circumstances, if you're eating a normal diet, you probably have less than 24 hours of glycogen stores. And if you're out vigorously exercising, that's probably somewhere closer to 2 to 4 hours. So oftentimes people who are running like a half marathon or maybe a marathon in that sort of 2 to 4 hour range, if you're not continuing to take in carbohydrates while you're running, you don't have that immediate fuel source to break down to help kind of fuel the whole process of running. So then your body goes into its glucose stores, which is glycogen. And so the glucagon goes up, it breaks the glycogen down, converts it back into glucose, and you use that as an energy source. But after about 2 to 4 hours of vigorous exercise, again, like for the example of running a marathon, once you've broken that down, then you don't have a fuel source. So when you hear about people talking about how they hit the wall, that's what they're referencing, right? They've gotten to where they nearly have depleted their glycogen stores. And then it gets more difficult to then begin to burn fat. And particularly when you're in like a zone 3, zone 4, zone 5 heart rate, it is definitely more difficult to break down fat into a usable source, which would be breaking it back down into glucose. That's sort of the overview of how this works. So when you are on a ketogenic diet, you're minimizing your carb intake so you have no immediate fuel. And over time, you've depleted, over time, meaning say the first few days of being on the ketogenic diet, you've depleted or significantly diminished your glycogen stores. So then your body is sort of forced to then take the fat that you've stored and begin to convert it back into glucose as a primary energy source. It doesn't convert it into glucose, it converts it into ketone bodies, which can then be used as a fuel source. So there are a lot of side effects that happen with the keto diet. Most of them happen early on. And if you stay on the diet for a prolonged period of time, they say that these really regulate themselves and begin to improve. But initially, as you go through this, your insulin levels decrease because you're not having high levels of sugar, of glucose floating around the system. So your insulin levels decrease, and consequently, your sodium levels really begin to rise. And so when that happens, you begin to urinate a lot. And so that's one of the things that you'll notice is you start to pee a whole bunch there in these first few days, and you can become quite dehydrated. And associated with that, you can get electrolyte imbalances, particularly magnesium, sodium, and potassium. And then along with the dehydration, you can get constipation. You're prone to developing kidney stones. Uric acid levels rise, which uric acid is associated with an illness called gout, which is where you get these uric acid crystals deposited in various joints, most commonly your big toes. And you also have some increased risk of bone fractures. You also get oftentimes what's called the keto flu, where you just don't feel well, right? Your metabolism is changing and a lot of things begin to feel different and your body just isn't used to it. And so along with that, you can have significant sugar cravings, right? Because your brain is used to having sugar as its primary fuel source. And when that gets depleted and you start to convert into eating at ketone bodies, it really craves that sugar. So you have significant sugar cravings. But you can also develop just typical flu-like symptoms, nausea, dizziness, headache, muscle cramps. You just feel like you have the flu. You just feel weak. A lot of times those muscle cramps are secondary to those electrolyte imbalances that we talked about. And that usually only lasts about 1 to 2 weeks. And then things begin to sort of normalize because you get used to the effects of it. So now that we understand a little bit about physiologically how the keto diet works, let's talk a little bit about what the diet actually looks like on a daily basis. So of course, with this diet, you have to significantly decrease your carbohydrate intake. So, that basically means that grains, including whole grains, most fruits, any baked goods, chips, starchy carbohydrates, fries, things like that, sugar, bread, honey, all these things are off the table, at least in the strictest form, right? And at best, you want to have 25 to 50 grams a day. Now, typically, most people have closer to 400 grams a day on a regular diet. So on a keto diet, you are massively restricting that. Then what you supplement the diet with, or what you replace those calories with, are fats. And fats primarily in the form of like nuts and seeds. Avocado is a good source of fats. A lot of hard cheeses work well. Butter, tallow, eggs, Greek yogurt. All of these are high in fat, low in carb, and then that becomes your primary fuel source. You can have protein, and you should have protein. Probably about 20% of your diet should be protein, but that should be like lean cuts of meat, such as beef, pork, chicken. And you don't want to eat too much protein because the excess protein can be broke down, and there are some proteins that then ultimately can be converted to glycogen and then broke down into glucose. So you want to limit your protein so that you don't get a backdoor effect where you begin to develop glycogen and then ultimately glucose. So this diet, it sounds real good. You think on the surface, oh yeah, high fat diet, that sounds good, because we're told so often that you have to restrict the fat in your diet to lose weight and to have a quote, heart healthy diet. Well, I hope this podcast has done a lot to dispel that myth. But also, I just think that having a high-fat diet where you're markedly reducing your carbs and your protein may not be your best option either. What we know is that people who go on the keto diet, they tend to do real well. They lose a lot of weight that first month. Of course, the first few days, they lose a whole lot of weight, but a lot of that's water weight. But they're able to sustain that weight for about a month. And then the second month, they continue to lose weight, but usually not at the same rate. But usually by about the end of the second month, the beginning of the third month, they have what's called the keto plateau, where it just becomes very difficult to continue to lose weight on this diet. Now, it's difficult to be compliant with it, but if you are, it's very effective at losing weight. The problem with it is that it's really not a terribly sustainable diet for most people. In the past, we've talked about the role of various diets, high-fat diet, such as this, high-protein diet, low-carb diet, all these variations. But if you'll remember, the best predictor of sustained weight loss at the 2-year mark was the diet that you were compliant with, right? So having a diet that is restrictive like this, or seemingly, at least to me, seems quite restrictive, is very difficult to be compliant with long-term. And so when we think of a diet, I really want everybody to think of it in terms of a dietary modification, right? If we've got obese and overweight and unhealthy dietary patterns, and you change them until you meet a certain goal, say you change them until you lose 50 pounds, but then you go back to those same poor dietary habits, you're going to have the same effect. You're going to put that weight back on. When you go on a diet, it shouldn't be a short-term deal. It should be something that you can sustain. And, you kind of have to bump into it, right? You kind of have to try various things. And although I think the keto diet is effective for weight loss, at least on the front end, I think it's very hard for most people to sustain. Now, there are always those subset of people that really adhere to this diet and do quite well. And I'm sure on multiple podcasts and YouTube videos, et cetera, you can find a lot of people giving strong testimonies for the keto diet. But I just think that in terms of long-term compliance and healthy lifestyle, this probably isn't the best diet. The other drawback to it is that you actually cut out a whole lot of healthy choices, right? I mean, there's a lot of fruits and vegetables that you just really shouldn't have on this because they're too rich in carbohydrates. But you get a lot of other antioxidants, minerals, vitamins. There's just a lot of benefit to a lot of the foods that you have to cut out of this. Although I do think limiting our carbohydrates as a society is great, and I think that will go a long way toward weight loss, I would just really caution about this. And I would just advise you to really look into this diet and the potential side effects. And don't just be enamored by the initial weight loss, because you will lose weight on it for sure. If you're compliant with this for the first couple of months, you'll lose a significant amount of weight. But the sustainability is difficult. And so you think, well, maybe I just go on this and I lose that weight and then I make some modifications to my diet. And maybe that's the answer. But maybe just a more sustainable diet, something that you can fit into your lifestyle. Maybe it's nothing more than calorie restriction, but something that's more sustainable is probably a better option. So hopefully that answers some questions on the keto diet. We'll continue on this series of the various diets, started with the Mediterranean diet and have now discussed the keto diet. And we'll go over the other diets in the upcoming podcast. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to hit us up on any of our social media or go to our website, thebmipodcast.com. If you have a diet that you'd particularly like to hear about, I'd be happy to address that. Just send in a request. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI Podcast. See you then. The BMI Podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Be sure to check out our description below for our website and social media platforms.